Run over here awkwardly. Welcome, all right, to the kickoff of the 2025 TOK talks here at EF Academy in New York. With us today, from this side over, is Mr. Barton, TOK teacher, Liv, TOK senior, myself, Mr. Johnson, TOK teacher, Wael, TOK senior, and at the end, Mr. Quinlan. All right, and our topic today is the first prescribed title of the series, which is this interesting directive to historians and human scientists about this ethical obligation. So the language we're given is the following. Do historians and human scientists have an ethical obligation to follow this directive? Do not ignore contradictory evidence. Okay, and it goes without saying that for this PT, the students need to focus on the two AOKs of history and human science, and we'll jump right into it. From the get-go, I wanted to ask the panelists what their rough and ready definitions of kind of three terms or phrases built into this PT might be. And kind of working backwards, the first phrase we probably want to pin down as best as we can would be this curious phrase, contradictory evidence. Evidence is a classical TOK concept, but for our purposes today, we might want to think more carefully about what counts as evidence. And this whole phrase is a package, contradictory evidence. What does that mean? And how might it contrast, like we did in class earlier today, how might it contrast with other terms such as negative evidence or counter evidence and other close cousins? So who might first want to share their 2 cents on what does this phrase contradictory evidence mean?
Okay. So like for me, I would say like contradictory evidence is like a stronger evidence or like a more like reliable evidence that like would erase or like make the previous evidence like less trustworthy, I would say, in terms of like when we talk about like history, same for like human sciences.
Okay, let's trustworthy. Yeah. Other thoughts here?
I agree. So I wrote it down as information that kind of directly conflicts with already existing data or with an already existing argument. So
Okay. Less trustworthy.
I would agree with the conflict part. I think to be contradictory, it has to at least be opposing, in some way diminish the likelihood of the previous evidence or theory that's established. By contradictory, it could be something that makes the other thing less likely, or it could be something that if it's true, like a strong definition would be, if this is true, then the other thing cannot be true. That's a strong definition of contradictory. You could have contradictory in kind of like small differences. So if I say this started in 1918, you say it started in 1919, or something like that, you could actually be really supporting what I said, but there's a small kind of disagreement. Technically, those things are contradictory, but they're not really against what I'm saying in the broader sense. So what do we mean by contradictory evidence? We normally think of something that is really against the previous thing that's been said. I normally think of the starting point for evidence as being a court of law or something like that. We often use that analogy of two cases and the evidence supports one claim, maybe that someone's guilty or innocent, and the other person defends against that. But it's very oppositional. But I don't think that all science works like that, nor history. You can have multiple claims and it's not just one side and another side. So we're going to have to kind of work out what counts as contradictory. Does it just have a different point of view, or does it have to be a completely opposite point of view?
Interesting. So it seems like before the panel began, we were discussing the spectrum that evidence itself as a term might lie on, but perhaps contradiction as a term as well is on a spectrum.
Yeah,
So once again, difficult to pin down. Yeah.
Yeah, Yes, I think they're somewhat connected, they're also like, you suggest, they're also independent. So for instance, as a historian, what evidence is it, right? Because if it's a document, well, the words on the document are not gonna change based on who's looking at it, right? If it's an artifact, that might have some interpretation involved in it. But if we're talking about, if you're doing oral history, well, you may see something and we all see the same event, but there could be 5 different examples of evidence, right, of what we saw. And maybe they're contradictory, right? So part is the type of evidence. And then this idea of contradiction, history is very much an interpretive discipline. And you can have different interpretations that don't always contradict. Then of course you have the polar opposite ones which do contradict. So yeah, it gets really complicated in how you're looking at this. And you know, from what I understand about the human sciences, also interpretive, but the type of evidence sometimes is data-based. Right, and we can use data in statistics and history, but it's more about, you know, documentation for the most part.
Yeah, it's interesting you use the case of an artifact or an object, perhaps having a wider range of interpretability compared to language. I just noted that as an interesting phenomenon. I could see that being the case. Yeah, so in this, I think for the sake of our conversation today, again, in terms of our talk before the panel, it does sound like we might want to water down the strength of this phrase, and it's in our power to do so. Like Mr. Barton was saying, there is a logical definition of contradiction, which is perhaps the strongest. But that would imply a lot of things. It would imply that we're thinking in a black and white, probably binary manner, where there are only truths and falsehoods in the world. And we probably don't want to do that. And furthermore, we're not specifically focused on logic and kind of paradoxes per se. So I think a slightly weaker take on contradictory evidence that involves opposition, conflict. And I like Wailo's contribution of it ultimately making your view less credible or trustworthy. Or
probably like overpower like the other one.
Okay.
Think about it.
Yeah, so changing the believability of what the original stance may have been. Let's move on to our 2 other key terms and phrases. So we've got contradictory evidence pinned down. The key verb of this PT is this otherwise innocent ignoring. Okay, and so again, I suspect a spectrum might come up. And certain adjectives I want to just throw out are these ideas of actively ignoring something or directly ignoring something, as opposed to putting yourself in a context where it's convenient or easy or comfortable to ignore something. So I think this is going to kind of be part of the spectrum as well too, but I wonder if you guys could help me pin this down a bit more. What does this PT mean by ignoring, this key verb?
Could it mean discard? But in order to discard it, you first have to consider it.
Yeah, I like that word discard. And there's another kind of ignoring which is like prejudicial, like before even really considering it, you've discarded that, pre-discarded it. And maybe a different verb would be better than discard in that case, because that suggests you've taken it up and then said, no, I'm going to ignore that. But that has actually involved considering and then choosing to ignore it later.
Like confirmation bias.
So a stronger definition of ignore would be, I'm not even going to pay attention in the first place. And that seems more problematic, that you're just kind of shutting your ears to certain views or evidence in advance, and a more prejudicial approach.
Yeah, yeah. A nice paradox does arise here, I must point out, is, you know, if we take this more extreme view, rooted in confirmation bias, you know, if we don't know, if a researcher, historian, or human scientist isn't aware in any real sense of their ignorance, what they're otherwise ignoring, to what extent should they be, you know, ethically questioned for their stripe of mind, their inclinations. And so we already have a nice paradox on the table. But other views about what ignorance might mean in the context of this PT?
I mean, for my view, I would say like I agree with like Mr. Barton. Like first of all, like we have like to distinguish like either if like they taking it like into consideration and like ignoring it, or like they just ignoring it from like the first place. So like probably they have like specific like belief or like bias towards like something, and like just like someone like show up or like evidence like show up to like contradict like the other one. But like they're against that belief and bias, they're just gonna like ignore it from like the first place and not look at it.
Okay.
So that's what I think.
All right.
I guess we could also think about why information would be ignored. Like, so, like it could be either ignored because it maybe opens something up that they don't want to consider, or it contradicts something, you know, in a way that might like really change things.
Yeah.
And if you don't want that to happen, then you might want to say, okay, we're gonna ignore this, or you ignore it because it's just like, if you have a whole set of data and it's just like maybe one point going out of line, you're like, well, we could maybe ignore this, because then it makes our data more clear.
Yeah, this is going to be a good source of ideas for us, the idea of approximation. That will come up later on for sure, absolutely. Okay, so that's our rough conception of what ignoring might amount to. I do want to take just a little bit of time to also define ethical obligation. This is bread and butter language of TOK, but right in the center of this PT, and so we do want to kind of, at least amongst each other, say exactly what we mean by ethical obligation, especially in the context of these researchers. And I want to categorize this. We did this in class earlier, because these researchers, historians, and human scientists, they have ethical obligations to us as knowers, as consumers of the knowledge, laymen in general. We know this. That's kind of the easy bit of this question. But I'm also interested, and I think it matters for answering this PT, what is their ethical obligation to each other, their colleagues, within their community of research? I feel like that's going to come into play too. So, yeah, first and foremost, ethical obligation. What's a nice way for us to capture what that might mean?
I would say for that probably like the fact that they have like to provide like for us probably like credibility for like of the sources, or like probably like also like pursuing like the truth and like offering us not like a biased evidence or something, and more like evidence that is more like based on like data or statistic, or like probably like documents and like information that are more like reliable, without including any like feelings or bias in it.
Okay.
When I
Other
think
thoughts?
of ethical obligation, how do we define what counts as within the realm of ethics? And one broad definition of ethics says that everything matters. So there is an ethics of how you sit, and there's an ethics of how you eat, and there's an ethics of pretty much every action, because every action has some kind of consequence, and therefore whatever thing you are doing, there's an ethics to that. There's a kind of more narrow definition, which maybe we might use the word morality for that, where only certain things are in this realm of a narrow version of ethics if it's related to the Ten Commandments, or when it is kind of limited, I don't want to say that's limited, something that has a certain number of things that count as moral questions. This is a moral question, that's a moral question, but how you eat is, that's just a personal thing or something like that. So I would say that personally, if I was writing, I would probably consider that, yeah, there is definitely an ethical dimension to academic work, and that obligations come from either, in ethics we normally divide three kind of typical broad theories, either duty-based theories, there's some kind of obligation that comes from the very nature of an act, this is either your duty or responsibility or not. Consequence-based theories, which is the ethics of a choice, comes from what it does to the community or to the people involved in that scenario, or virtue-based things, which is like the ethics comes from the character of the person doing it. So we would look at the ethics of a historian based on whether they had certain virtues or vices in the way they were doing what they were doing. Those are the three main theories that I would think students should consider trying to apply in this question.
Yeah, yeah. Now that Mr. Barton had brought up the three dominant Western traditions of ethics, this language of ethical obligation, this full package I gave to you guys, it does strike me as being rather Kantian in nature, duty-based. Obligation gives us this sense of a capital M must or a capital O ought, some kind of universal maxim duty that researchers are bound to, an imperative to follow. So, yeah, again, I am curious, between researchers within their community, you guys brought up these other close cousins too. In any community, we always have etiquette, something like etiquette, social norms, cultural norms, and kind of this narrow conception of morality, like Mr. Barton said. But I think we should focus on this broader conception of ethics, and within these research communities, why does it matter? Again, it's very easy for us to answer why it matters for researchers to follow this imperative when it comes to us consumers of their product. But between themselves, I wonder if anyone can speak to that. Like, why does this matter so much within the context of the research community?
If somebody is, I'm thinking of, like, I'm going to start with the example of history, and someone's trying to do research in an area. So within the idea of like responsibilities to one another, and I go to somebody and they spent a long time researching something and they produced a book, and they have chosen either deliberately or through bias, having considered something and decided it wasn't important, or they just kind of discarded it. They've decided to leave something out, maybe a document, a perspective that they thought wasn't worthy to go in their book. The person that comes after them and goes to that book to get the information is then kind of deprived of access to a perspective that they might have decided was important. Now, while if you author a book, you have the right to decide what's important, and you have a right to tell your story. But I think there is a kind of an obligation to the people that come after, who might think, well, this is a definitive book that I need to read if I want to know all about this conflict, and they actually are missing something.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. I'd like to develop this a bit further through analogy too, because even though I'm not a historian, we have one here. I can't help but see an analogy to the discipline of history writ large, because when I think of history as an AOK, we can't help but notice there's a certain filter applied to the past. There are only certain events, be them political or economic or social, what have you, but only certain events make it into the book, as Mr. Barton says. And so it seems like history as a discipline, no matter what, comes with it this kind of difficult question of what makes it through the filter. And I wonder if we can entangle that with this question of ignoring. That may pertain more to this nature of what gets discarded, like you said.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, we could actually talk about, say, an anecdote, an actual event. So in the, I think it was in the 80s, 1980s, maybe 1990s, there was, his name was, I can't remember his first name, Lynch, and he found something it was called the Hitler Diaries.
Okay.
And it became this huge sensation. It was like literally a diary of Hitler. Okay. And it became kind of justified some very fascistic ideals and racial biases and hatreds. It was used to help debunk the Holocaust. And it was because this man literally had a legitimate name as a careful ethical historian. It really gave it a lot of power and impact. And so now some people are starting to go, oh wait, this is another interpretation, this one we've not seen before, and it was all bogus.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Right.
So if you're interested, you could go, someone could go and actually look a little bit more, because it's been a while since I've actually looked at it. I might have a few details wrong, but certainly would be something to think about.
Yeah.
There was a whole trial around the Holocaust with David Irving.
Irving, that's the man I'm thinking of, yes.
Yeah, that Holocaust denier, so that students might use that. I think that seems like an interesting question. There is a law in Germany about Holocaust denial, which is interesting because, that already prescribes you must ignore certain contradictory evidence if it makes this claim, not just you should. That's a really interesting approach to history. I don't know if we can use that in human sciences in the same way, but because science to me implies a different kind of purpose. History is, you could say, well, history is about telling the truth, but I think history is not as simple as that. It's about telling certain stories that we decide to preserve, and the idea that there is one truth rather than many truths is problematic in history anyway.
Yeah. It also makes me wonder whether this category of conspiracy theories that deny something from ever having happened. There's something about denialism that strikes me as important here, as opposed to a positive theory. Gets back to logic again. It makes a difference whether you're trying to prove the case that something in
It
fact
also comes back
exists.
to ignore.
Yeah.
Right? So the field could ignore conspiracy theory because we won't accept it into our canon. On the other hand, we can't ignore it because some people will come to believe it. And then in a broader audience, outside of the professional field, it could become accepted as truth, or at least valid. That's probably a better word, valid.
Yeah, and actually, to get more practical, which is not always my forte, but in the world we're headed into, where, this kind of world of everyone's an expert. We've got every single one of us is an expert now on medical science. When we search or diagnose ourselves on webmd.com, that does seem to be the clear trend, and I think as a practical matter, what you're bringing up, Mr. Quinlan, is really going to make an impact in otherwise kind of theoretical research in the future, like knowing what most laymen happen to believe, as conspiratorial as it might be, might ultimately be an important factor, at least trying to, there could be all this extra effort amongst scientists and historians to kind of
Well, for all we know, there are conspiracy theories from hundreds and hundreds of years ago that we've lost the roots of the conspiracy theory, and we now accept it as truth, and it could be completely false.
Right. So we've already started quite seamlessly into this AOK of history, and perhaps we can focus more in on this PT with respect to history and how it might be different than the sciences. I liked, Mr. Barton just brought up something we were discussing before the panel as well. When I thought about this PT, I did think about a universal principle that at least any good scientist ought to follow, namely pursue the truth, capital T truth. And for me personally, it's kind of the one and only principle. And it makes me wonder how such an ethical principle, if we want to label it as such, is related to this principle of not ignoring contradictory evidence. And this is especially more difficult for me when it comes to history as an AOK. And it would be really helpful, we already had this one example you provided of the Hitler diaries. I wonder if we had any other examples in history especially counterexamples in the sense that we can justify this ignoring. We have conspiracy theories on the table. Is there something that's less conspiratorial that might still be justifiable in the context of history?
I think something that could be like a counter in terms of like AUKF history, you can like throw up like the ancient Egypt like pyramids, you know, like because like some people believe that it was like built by them, but like there's like no strong evidence that it was actually built by the like ancient Egypt people. Rather, but they still don't know like who built it. So like they believe that it was built by the people then, but there is not enough like source and evidence to like contradict this this like recent
Yeah. Well, yeah, one interesting thing why I was bringing up is what makes history unique compared to all the other AOKs is the idea that we may never have the evidence or enough evidence for a particular.
Never.
Yeah, we may never. It's like in any other AOK we think about it, it seems to be always a possibility at least. Yeah.
I have an example it's hypothetical, but I'm going to try and ground it in some real history if I can. Let's say I decide as a historian that I want to write about the Underground Railroad, and that my purpose is I want people to recognize the heroism of the people involved. And I go about trying to get to the documents, construct maybe 5 stories of 5 people and what they did and how it was heroic. And I choose to ignore maybe somebody who was involved in the railroad who was a scammer or who was a bad person. Well, let's say it goes against my main thesis or my main purpose of my book, which is to tell the story of heroism. I choose not to include this person in my book. You could say, well, I haven't told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but. But I think my history is perfectly valid. The purpose of my book wasn't to include everybody. It was to alert people to something. I think in history, as always, and more, we're in an attention economy now with different things trying to attract our attention, but in history, it's not just a case of what is the truth of the time. It's like, what is being ignored? What do people need to hear that they don't know? And I feel a lot of history is about that. It's trying to raise people's consciousness of stuff they might not know. And if I'm trying to include every single person ever, then I can't ever do history. We're always making choices. So I think it's a reasonable choice to say, I'm going to tell this story because I think this is a valuable story. And it would kind of ruin it to include this other person who was a scumbag, or, excuse me.
I think that would be completely acceptable in the historical field, right? Because you've chosen, right? It's called hagiography, right? Hagiography. And a lot of old history is hagiography. But in terms of understanding how the Underground Railroad, we would not rely only on one source, right? So you provide, your hypothetical book would provide one piece of the story of the Underground Railroad. As a historian, it's my duty, my responsibility to use multiple sources, multiple interpretations, so I get the best understanding of the time.
Yeah, and that makes us wonder in the context, this is true, we spoke about this in class earlier. In history, we also have these different, quite starkly different lenses that we can approach history by, be it an economic interpretation of history, a social interpretation, a political interpretation, and then even subgenres within, feminist interpretations, Marxist interpretations.
Colonialism, post-colonialism.
Yeah, what have you. And this is a bit of a stretch. We don't want to consider frameworks and lenses as evidence per se, but nonetheless, their adoption as dominant frameworks at some point in time involved an accruing of evidence and an acceptance of their now dominant status as acceptable lenses that we ought to view history by. And so it's a bit of a stretch, but it's still interesting to me right now, like it almost, something you said just now, Mr. Quinn, it almost made me feel like someone could be a good historian by myopically viewing all of history, let's say through a Marxist lens, ignoring all these other frameworks and lenses, and publishing book after book, but they're still contributing to this greater discourse of other historians with feminist interpretations and economic interpretations. And so yeah, it's not quite a counterexample that I'm looking for, but I feel like there's a way into something closer to actively ignoring other approaches at least, if not.
I mean, that's just part of what you do, right?
Yeah.
You learn which historians are from which schools of thought, and basically that's what they're going to do, but that's why you have to collect the variety of the array.
Yeah.
And this is why it's contradicting to a certain extent, but it's also a challenge of a different interpretation, which is completely valid, as long as your reputation, of course, which is based on, if you really want to dig into the granular, you have to look at what evidence that is being used to support those interpretations as well.
Yeah. So in that case, I'm wondering if the inversion is almost true in terms of if someone approaches history through a particular lens, is there a sister ethical obligation that says one should dogmatically study their field through their chosen lens, like as systematically and myopically as possible? Is that, or would that be too extreme? I mean, someone could always have a career change. I don't want to sabotage their flexibility, but based on the way you describe it, it almost seems like a division of labor. As long as you can count on these other colleagues providing these other perspectives, is there something beneficial about kind of, because I will say this happens in philosophy, and philosophy has a lot of overlap with history, and we have different approaches, different schools of thought, and there is some sense in kind of pushing your view or theory to its logical conclusion, even if ultimately some of your premises you question yourself. Nonetheless, there's value in kind of seeing that part of the conceptual landscape, especially if it's going to be plugged into this broader context of different approaches and different frameworks. But again, maybe this is stretching the sense of evidence much beyond the scope of what we should look at. We do have another AOK on the table, which is a very large one. I think the TOK, putting sociology and linguistics, and anthropology and psychology and economics and all these fields into a big umbrella of human science is quite ridiculous in my personal opinion. It's not always clear to me what the similarity is between all these fields. But we're lucky in that sense, because now we can pick and choose any of them that pertain. And I think psychology is definitely, as always, is going to be quite useful here. So I'm wondering if we have examples, and especially counterexamples, in the human sciences, in particular psychology, that we might want to think about. And the first thing that did occur to me, Sigmund Freud was, in his time, sometimes criticized. In retrospect, we tend to, at least readers of Freud, tend to celebrate this feature of his writing. But he had a lot of directly conflicting evidence and strong documentation of the failures of his experiments and his studies. And he had a lot of that in his writings. And we don't see so much of that today, even amongst the best human scientists. Even if someone is following this rule, they're not in their everyday scientific life, they're not ignoring contradictory evidence, and they're engaging with colleagues that have hold different beliefs. Nonetheless, when it comes to their published papers, they're not really kind of writing at length all of this additional contradictory evidence. They're usually kind of focused on their positive project. But it is something that stood out with psychologists like Freud, amongst many others too. But I think psychology is definitely going to be an example where we can find some cases of being justified in ignoring certain evidence. I don't know if you guys we have applied examples in medicine.
So like I would say, I don't know, like maybe a counterexample is like people like writing COVID, so like there are like specific people, like majority, like not majority, but like a good percentage of people that like were like anti like vaccine like during COVID, and like they kind of like ignore like all the like sources and like whatever that came about like the vaccine and like how useful it is and like the need to like actually do it. They still ignore it, and like their belief was like maybe it brings like other diseases, it's not as effective, they have like long-term like effects later on and stuff like that. So I think that would be like a counter. That could be useful, I don't know, probably.
Yeah. One thing, the people in that case would be everyday citizens.
Yeah.
I don't think, unless we could.
I mean,
think
there are
about-
also like scientists and probably also like human scientists that also contradict with it, and probably due to their like biases, you know, because some of them like believe in the case that the COVID was like produced by China, so like they also was like against the vaccine, and they're like, oh no, don't do it because it was like produced, like probably this also vaccine is produced by China, so like it's more like biases, and we don't have also like reliable information. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Barton?
I was thinking that we could apply, well, first of all, I like the idea that the example of the vaccine stuff could produce some good examples in human science, as long as we don't get into the medical area, which could be more of a natural science issue. But in terms of how people responded, I think there's probably already been quite a number of human science studies I'm not familiar with, but people looking into that. And because of the nature of what happened and the fact that it happened in the internet age, you mentioned before, there's a kind of overwhelming amount of evidence available, and therefore if we're going to survive, we have to do some ignoring just to keep sanity almost, right? We can't spend our time looking at every theory that someone comes up with in this day and age, because we have to get on with our lives. So one question we can ask in human science and in natural science too, but it's this issue of induction. You never quite proved anything. You can have shown a pattern to obtain. In natural science, you might think, okay, I found a law, this law is going to apply. I don't need to keep boiling water to check it's going to boil at 100 degrees centigrade every day. But with human sciences, we know from the past that these things are often not replicable, and that a study might have been done in one place and not apply in a different place, or done at one time and not apply at a different time, because the material we're studying, people and beliefs and behaviors, are so different from place to place and time to time. We don't really have laws. Got a little bit lost in my train of thought here, but I was kind of get at this idea that in human science, ignoring contradictory evidence, it can't really be done. But also, sorry, I was trying to make the point that you can at some point, if you find a pattern and it seems to hold, and someone says, well, I have some contradictory evidence. At some point you have to kind of move on and say, well, I like my theory, it works for now.
Yeah. Perhaps another way to repackage what Mr. Barton is giving us, and Liz, alluded to this earlier, that the power of approximation, especially in these qualitative sciences, we can't ever discount that. An approximation can be quite powerful often, and even things in psychology, once again, that we already are quick to kind of do away with, like personality types, for example. I guess we can envision a future psychology that kind of gives us personality profiles that are even more empirically credible, and they approximate certain kind of psychological profiles that we all fall into. And with analogy to natural science, even though we tend to be stricter and it's more exact and quantitative, nonetheless, we have all these amazingly powerful approximations, and we would never want to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater by saying, oh, I'm a perfectionist, and I found your error of rounding is off by 0.0001 centimeter here, and based on the new theory, we should definitely entirely discard this old theory. Yeah, we don't do that. I mean, we can still send rockets. You know, Elon Musk can put a spaceship on Mars using Newtonian physics if he wanted to. I don't know if he will. He seems to kind of be flaky on his plan now, but nonetheless, he could. So approximation does seem to be a way in here. Both of you guys have brought this up. Approximation seems to always be present, especially in human science. And it's a tough question whether we have contradictory evidence which is sufficient to kind of ultimately abandon that theory, or this more interesting case of like, oh, I am now justified in ignoring this contradictory evidence because it's only pointing to the approximation aspect of this other theory, and it's not really pointing to.
Well, you're kind of, I think you're pointing towards the field of statistics here. That's what I'm thinking of. There are, within statistics, it's not an exact science. There are mathematical aspects to it, but there are different approaches to what is reasonable to consider an ignorable anomaly. Let's say I'm trying to find a pattern in how certain people behave under certain circumstances, and I do a sample of 1,000 people, and I plot my graph, and these people did this, and these people did that, and I find a certain pattern. Typically in the human sciences, that you're not going to find a straight line, you're going to find a kind of scatter, and you draw a line. So all the time you're kind of ignoring the outliers a little bit, and you're allowed to in statistics to do that. Say maybe there's unusual circumstances. If we're going to make any theories or find any patterns, they're going to be general and imprecise in human sciences, and so we have to kind of ignore things a little bit to find any pattern at all.
Perhaps the responsibility then lands upon, I wonder if the difference that makes a difference is being explicit about that. You know, if a researcher, in particular a psychologist, once again I'm thinking of, because in the past decade psychology has been under threat. There's been a crisis, precisely the problem Mr. Bart just talked about. All these professional psychologists have been accused of kind of blatantly ignoring outliers in their data. But by the same token, like Mr. Barton said, according to statistical practice, maybe they can, maybe they were justified, but they weren't explicit about having done that. You know, if that's in the writing, similar to what Freud sometimes did, is that kind of enough to tie the ribbon on what is otherwise a highly controversial aspect? Is that the missing ingredient, or am I oversimplifying things? Just being explicit is like, hey, I had 3 outlets. I found the best fit curve for my thousands of data points, and there are 3 outliers that were beyond certain standard deviations, and that's what I did. Is that enough?
How significant the outliers are? Like, how do we decide at what point the data is so significant that we need to include it, and like when is it like we can leave that out? Like where's that point? Where's that line?
Yeah. Especially if we're dealing with a qualitative science to begin with. It doesn't seem like we have a numerical boundary we could depend upon. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, you're talking about psychology. I've been thinking about, since we're having an election here in this country, all the political polls. Yeah. Right? And it's always a margin of error, right? And so, technically, if something's in the margin of error, we have to ignore whoever they say is winning. Right? If the margin of error is 4%, and candidate A is up 2%, well, then it's basically a tie. They're not really winning, right? Because of the margin in error, however the way it's presented.
Yeah.
But if we look at the evidence, perhaps you can look and see what kind of questions were being asked, what kind of wording was in the questions, what kind of order was the questions in, how are they determining, for instance, a likely voter, that becomes now, well, there is no such thing as a likely voter. So you're determining certain attributes, say this is a likely voter.
Yeah.
And so now that, if you have to look at the way they structure their surveys
Right.
to figure out why. And so it's a little bit narrower down in there. And, you know, you can accept it, right? But if it's, you know, like 6 or 8 or 10% off of the norm,
Yeah.
people go, okay, that's off. But if it's only like 5% off, you're like, well, okay, maybe. And yet, perhaps the whole questioning has been.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that. I'm surprised that hasn't come up yet. The methodology behind these qualitative sciences.
There are definitely things on YouTube you can find this.
Right.
Because certain people are claiming these surveys are being done to
Yeah.
justify the fact that it may not be a fair election.
Yeah.
Post haste.
Yeah. Yeah.
Post hoc.
Yeah. And it's incredible too, the qualitative sciences, how often the method of surveying or questionnaire is used.
And especially since 2016, the polling is no longer as accurate
Huh.
as it, in projecting the winners as it had been prior to 2016.
Yeah.
I was thinking that those of you who've just come from advisory, depending on what your advisor has done, may have been exposed to an interesting amount of human science that you could discuss.
Halloween dance party?
criticize.
Oh no, that was the other thing.
The other thing, right? So there are these courses from Yale online for well-being, and it's an interesting exposure to some examples of a course that's being taught at Yale that's in the social sciences that purports to be scientific, and there are studies, you know, they take their time to be academic about it. This study in this year, it's scientific, you can check it, you can peer review it, you can see their statistics if you want to dig down. It's got that scientific nature to it, but of course, at the same time, it also has a purpose. Right? The purpose of this series of talks is to promote positive psychology and well-being. So any studies that don't help with that are probably not going to be in the course, right? Because ultimately, there is an ethical obligation to tell the truth, but it's also within the human sciences, and I hope that what we're going to do is going to make the world better.
Yeah.
And you could say, well, in that part, it's not being scientific, but it is part of the humanities, right? A lot of time people are generating theory, I think, because it makes us feel better.
Yeah.
I know that doesn't seem like a science per se, but I think that we're entitled to do that. I was thinking as well, students may or may not know that we've been given a book to read as teachers this year. I have one on my desk in there, and it says as the subtitle, it's about the science of whatever it is.
Yeah.
And as you can see, I'm reading it so carefully.
Yeah.
But
It's got
the
one
only thing that
hidden
bothers me
potential,
about it is
yeah.
it claims to be scientific. What it does is, you know, try to make people feel more positive about how we can make a difference in
Yeah.
people's lives, which, you know, that's a great and worthy purpose, and
Yeah.
maybe it's okay for the humanities to do that.
Yeah.
It's just, I'm not so comfortable about calling it science.
Well, it's funny that you brought up purpose, but in history, if we're going to evaluate a source, a piece of evidence, we have to look at the purpose, because that's going to help us determine how much of that we accept at face value and how much we have to find corroboration elsewhere for. And so, you know, we try to use corroboration to minimize, or I'm sorry, to maximize our confidence in the information that we're going to then use as we present them.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the last 2 points there really shows us kind of all the way upstream and all the way downstream. Like Mr. Quinlan, like all the way upstream with these questionnaires and surveys, it reminds us of this incredible kind of linguistic variability. And then back to our advisory curriculum too, you know, these college students are being asked, you know, after graduation, to what extent do you take yourself to be happy? Okay, well, anyone who's taken TOK or philosophy will take a long time to answer that question, okay? They'll have lots of questions about that question. Like,
Put it on a scale of 1 to 10.
yeah, which philosopher's conception of happiness do you mean? What spectrum are you referring to? Yeah, how does it overlap with other emotions? Why is this the goal of life? Et cetera, et cetera. And So that's kind of the upstream thing of the methodology. But then downstream, like Mr. Barton is saying, is the kind of sometimes hidden agenda, hidden purposes, which is not truth-seeking per se. It's something quite different than truth-seeking. Okay, I think we've kind of reached our allotted time. And I do want, for our massive audience out there, internet, there's a whole room of exciting TOK students and TOK teachers. So I want to make sure everyone has a chance to ask a question. So if the panelists don't mind, any questions out there? I can't see everyone, so hold your hand high, please.
I'll let you all start. Well, I've got 3 of them, so I don't want to like monopolize. But I can start. Okay, so this one's the first one's a comment based on the example of Freud as a human scientist that came up. So yeah, like Freud was obviously a great teacher on how our mind works, but the biggest disaster of Freud happened when he systematically ignored evidence that contradicted his theory. So the most heinous offense was when he would have patients talk about experience of having been abused, he would discard them as a matter of theory. Because he leaned into the idea that most of what people would say in a psychoanalytic session was not necessarily the truth, but expressed either a desire or a phobia. And so he would discard, when people would talk about having been abused, he would discard that as almost by definition false, and an expression instead of either a desire or a phobia. And that's pretty, I'm generally a fan of Freud, but that's pretty monstrous to be, treating to be someone's counselor and ignore their testimony of what happened to them. So, I mean, that to me, Freud in that case is a very good example of the kind of catastrophe of ignoring contradictory evidence that doesn't fit in with your theory that you're like leaning into very hard.
Yeah.
So that was just one. The other one was picking up on something Mr. Bard mentioned, and the distinction between interpreting history and then communicating that interpretation. And he talked about the Underground Railroad example, which made me think of lots of other examples where a historian is trying to figure out the legacy of a person. And obviously human beings are deeply imperfect, so even someone who does a lot of heroic things, there are blemishes on that person's life. Martin Luther King, for instance, famously plagiarized either parts or entire sections of his doctoral thesis. And like there's the perception that when you tell that story or tell that narrative, that you kind of have to ignore blemishes like he plagiarized his doctoral thesis on the theory that like if you do include that, people are gonna see him less as a hero. So my view of that, and I'm curious about the panel, is that falls into a trap of thinking that in order to be useful as a hero or a model, that someone has to be perfect. That you can't mention the blemishes, because if you mention even a couple of blemishes, like he's bad to his wife, he plagiarizes, that the perception is that if you include those, it's going to damage people's perception of how heroic and important he was. So I guess I'm curious what people on the panel think about that. I mean, when you're assessing someone's legacy, you certainly do want to avoid I don't know how to pronounce hagiography, where you're treating someone as a saint.
Yeah.
But I don't know, do people agree that you can still mention, you don't have to ignore evidence that people are imperfect and do things like plagiarize doctoral dissertations. You can include that because I think people don't need a superhero in order to have a role model.
Yeah.
You don't need someone that's perfect in order to
Give it to you panelists, but I'll just quickly interject. I like what Mr. Markowitz gave us, is I feel like it's the character analog of the approximation conversation we had, which could be more numerical. So same kind of thing, like there could be this excessive desire for perfectionism, even if we're perceiving a narrative ultimately. And so back to not throwing the baby out of the bathwater with the approximation, like I think I'm inclined to say that we need to include these blemishes, and like it's still approximate this. If ultimately our purpose is to present a kind of heroic effort,
it's not doing anyone any favors to reduce a human being to what they
Yeah.
are definitely not, which is a perfect
Yeah.
human being.
I also
without
think
any
of
emotion.
Gandhi and domestic abuse.
Yeah,
isn't that?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Or Gandhi and his treatment of Muslims.
Yeah.
Or his attitude towards
Right.
Muslims. Yeah.
Right.
So I think.
I guess the question is like, do we have to, if we want to like make someone out to be a great person, do we have to ignore all of the evidence that inevitably is going to come with every human being that they're not actually perfect?
I feel like I would say yes, we have, because like at like some point like people would like, okay, we know that like not all human beings are perfect, and like so people will like use session like there's like a book or like something, and then you include this like negative aspect of it, you would like probably the reader who's like reading or like analyzing and something would be like biased towards like what he did like wrong or something, or and then they would like less considerate and probably like ignore it at that point.
But I mean, if you were reading, I'm just curious, not to put you on the spot, if you were reading a story of Martin Luther King that talked about the things that like really were heroic that he did, and then found out about the blemishes, I feel like most people hopefully can still like put together a picture of this is a great man, even though.
But still like reduces like you may seem like less heroic, especially like if you like relate to that thing, like you just mentioned like probably like Muslim, like as being like Muslim, you probably would like consider the action more effective, and like you would probably not follow that person and see him as like a villain instead of like heroic.
And the other thing, I don't know, I'm sorry to talk too much, but like I think in the stage of communicating history rather than simply interpreting it, obviously it needs to be kind of adjusted depending on who the audience is. I mean, you know, if I'm teaching Martin Luther King to elementary school students, that's probably too much complexity to understand like an important narrative. But by the time people can like, you know, hold two ideas in their mind at once, I think for me, it's, I don't know what you all feel, but like, it's important to be able to render him in all his humanity and not need to say, this guy is a god, a superhero without any flaws. Because it's not accurate, and it doesn't, you don't need to be that in order to be a great person and a role model.
But you could argue, or maybe you'd have to consider as an author, that this is there, and you know if you put that in the book, that some people will use that to denigrate this man,
Yeah.
and impugn his reputation. And so now do you want to, I guess you have yourself, I guess maybe it's a personal thing, right? Do you feel comfortable putting that in, knowing that some people is going to use this as a mark against this person who did great things, and which will completely, you know, it's basically a confirmation bias for a lot of people, right? Racial bias for a lot of people. So, you know, I think, you know, as the author of that book, you need to ask these questions. You can't say, well, I just want to paint a picture of, because he was a real human being, and he was, of course, right? So I guess there's a bigger question that the author has to ask him or herself when they're going to put that in there.
Yeah.
Which I guess could be argued as an ethical question, right? It might, do I want to diminish his accomplishments or let groups of people diminish his accomplishments?
But then ethically, is it okay to leave out information about somebody just to make people more likely to believe what that person said?
It's a good question.
It's a great,
Yeah.
if it makes the world a better place, you could argue from an ethical point of view, it's justified by the consequences, right? Utilitarian, pragmatic kind of approach, but it might turn out to come back and bite you. If you've left something out and someone discovers it and it undermines all your research.
Or perhaps think of it this way, is it okay to do that in 2024 with Martin Luther King versus 1966 with Martin Luther King in the height of the civil rights movement?
Yeah, that's important.
Okay.
Right, context.
Context matters. Yeah.
Y'all-
Yeah. Huge audience. Any other hands out there? If you can hear me. Yeah, there we go.
For me, I come up with an idea like during hearing your guys' conversation.
Mm.
It's like the fundamental attribution error.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, if I think like sometimes people try to ignore the contradictory evidence and because they wanna conclude something to help other people increase their some efficiency, something like they can do this but may sometimes make mistakes.
Yeah.
So like I mean the mistakes can avoid but they still need to do this, right?
Yeah. I'm sorry, panelists, I'm tempted to interject again. I thought of something similar to this, Ariel, before the panel talking with Mr. Barton, because I do believe, like I said earlier, in this ethical principle of scientists needing to seek the truth, pursue the truth, capital T truth, no matter what. I feel like that's the one and only principle. That's all that matters for me. But related to that, where this other question, this maximum of, I shouldn't have ignored contradictory evidence, it's still not clear to me. I'm really bothered how that's connected to this other principle that I do believe in. And this efficiency, you mentioned efficiency, this does occur to me, and I feel like we constantly deceive ourselves. We feel like there's a rush in science. I remind myself all the time that it turns out there's no rush. Like, we can solve physics in 400 years, that's fine. Neil deGrasse Tyson might have a fit, but no one else will care. Human science, psychology, we could take a few thousand years, or we could go extinct before we finish it. There's no intrinsic efficiency. Now, we all know, like during times of war, and when the military is providing money to scientists, it's like we get all these incredible inventions and so-called progress in the sciences. But to me, that's like not part of science at large. And so I like this notion of efficiency because it helps me think about these two principles side by side. Because I think scientists, perhaps not historians if we're telling a story or narrative, if that's the purpose, but I think any scientist, human or natural, ought to be seeking capital T truth. And I guess they might need to remind themselves that there's no rush. There's no real rush. And I feel like that's where this comes in. Like, you shouldn't ignore, right, I failed to mention that. Like, okay, so the power of this, if I'm a scientist and I ignore contradictory evidence, or I don't ignore contradictory evidence, that's really useful because it increases efficiency. Now I can like more quickly disprove my own theory or make progress in other areas. And so in terms of efficiency, it's a really useful maximum. But that's only in terms of efficiency. I don't really know if it's needed as long as you pursue the truth.
Yeah, I'm not sure we would consider there is a capital T truth in history.
Right.
Because we study human beings. Human beings, by definition, are flawed, right? Or by essence, I should say.
We hope
Except
there's a
for
capital T truth about the what happened. We hope that the other stuff gets involved in the why it happened or what should have happened. So,
I think, just to go back to the ethical theories aspect I brought up earlier, that it could be interesting to talk about the idea of do not lie as an ethical maxim, or tell the truth. Same thing, phrased positively. But we could also look at the virtue of being truthful. What does it mean to be an honest scientist? There's a philosopher called Alistair McIntyre who has spent quite a bit, and he wrote a lot of stuff on virtue theory. And he argues that the virtues that we have are relative to the practices that we're engaged in. So there are different virtues involved in being a historian than being a gardener. The kind of characters that are involved and the kind of things that are good and bad are slightly different in each circumstance. And I would say being truthful, to come back to this idea of truth, like, does it mean saying everything that is factual all of the time? Every time you find out a truth, you spend equal amounts of time on it. I think being truthful is kind of not as straightforward as that in society or in practice. I think as long as you're not deliberately misleading people, as long as you are accurately, reporting things and not shifting things, those are obvious ethical breaches of your work, but what you decide to include and so on, I think there are things that somebody who's very honest could quite reasonably exclude certain things. Not as a, I'm going to exclude it in it. Before we talked about ignoring as in prejudice ignoring, I'm not going to include that.
Yeah.
But you could evaluate the evidence and decide, this isn't worth my time. It's not worth people's time to read. Not all evidence is equal.
Can I pick up on that? Because my last question had to do with that. Like, this reminds me of a PT that was around, I think, 2 years ago, that was very similar, and it was, does it matter that when we acquire knowledge, we do it in bubbles that excludes certain kinds of voices, I think was the phrase, and information? And so I was thinking of a certain movement in history now called the 1619 Project, which is a way of compensating for the fact that for most of the way American history was told, certain voices were excluded, mostly the voices of slaves themselves. 1619 is the first year that slaves came to what became the United States. And so for most of the way that the story of American history is told is basically treating the founding fathers, the white founding fathers, as saints and visionaries. And so the 1619 Project turns it upside down and tells the story from the point of view of slaves, and talks about how perhaps racism was baked into the founding of America, but they very honestly and very consistently downplay the role of people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and they're not, it's a kind of discarding where they know about it, but they exclude it from the way the story is told, so that their narrative can make sense, that they're compensating by going on the other end of the pendulum and saying, our story's been ignored for most of the way American history is told, now we're gonna focus on that and ignore the other stuff. The movement's been criticized for not being historically accurate, because among other things, Abraham Lincoln's characterized as a white supremacist, which he wasn't. But I wonder what you think about that, when you have a movement that is aiming to make up for certain voices being excluded. Is it justified for that movement to tell the story of the excluded voice and in turn push to the side the dominant voice that was dominant for?
Good question. I mean, there's whole fields in history that do that, like post-colonialism, right?
Yeah, like any ism, like Marxist history or feminist.
Marxist interpretation really was like that. But then you can come to the question is, let's say we want to do a history of India, right? And we're in the medieval India, and we want to do a women's history of India. Well, when you start looking to see whose voices you're going to hear, when you look at the evidence that describes what life was like for women, guess what? It's not coming from women, right? Because of the context. So that's the other problem we have in history. Whose voice do we have? For instance, when I did my master's thesis, it was on juvenile delinquency in Victorian England. Well, almost all the voices I heard were adults, not the children. And when I did find records of children, they're giving testimony before Parliament. Well, guess who's influencing what they're saying, right? So, how do I find the history of an 8-year-old in 1840 Birmingham? Right? It can be very difficult, and that's why we can never get a T. And even if we got really close, say we got so close, we're pretty much sure there's two things, one particular thing will never be able to teach anybody, right? We cannot go back and have the sensation of smell, right? And what I was looking at was before, there was massive plumbing, right? Sewage system. And I couldn't imagine living in some of these, in New York City we call them tenements, and there they call them rookeries. And there is no toilet. And in fact, one thing I read was a strip of townhouses, not really townhouses because they're apartments, but at the end there was an open field that was basically just this cesspit that they dug into the ground and you just threw everything in there.
Lovely.
right? And so basically you're living every day of your life inundated with the odor of waste. And how does that affect your experience and your psychology, right?
Yeah.
So we can never go up, we can get a good approximation if we, come back, but we'll never be 100%.
Yeah. Other questions from the huge audience? No? All right, maybe let's thank the panelists.